Hello and welcome to Read Through the Word. My name is Dawn and I am so glad that you're joining me here today. Today is Saturday, March 8th, and we are in the book of Numbers. The lesson for today is called The Importance of And. And our key verse will be from Numbers chapter 27, verses 18 through 20. The Lord replied, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, who has the Spirit in him, and lay your hands on him. Present him to Eleazar the priest before the whole community, and publicly commission him to lead the people." So we are at a pretty key turning point in our story in the Old Testament, where leadership is going to be handed over from Moses to Joshua. And the people need to know and feel that they're going to have another leader and that the authority of Moses will be transferred to a new leader. So this is a pretty key turning point here. And this narrative about Joshua becoming the leader or being appointed as the new leader for the Israelites comes amidst a very interesting sort of Hebrew idea that we're going to talk about today. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the word spirit. In the verse we just read, the Lord said, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, who has the Spirit in him." And we've actually talked about this word before. It's the word ruach. And I know I've mentioned this in previous lessons. The Hebrew word ruach is the same word we see back in Genesis when God is breathing life. It can mean spirit or wind or breath. It's used many times throughout the Old Testament with those different meanings. Basically, ruach conveys the idea of life, power, divine presence, and can be associated with God's creative or sustaining power, as well as his presence and influence in the world and in individuals. So lots of meaning wrapped up in this word, and it could mean multiple different things together, or it could mean individual different things depending on the context. But in Numbers 27, 18 through 20, it's very clear that God is saying Joshua, son of Nun, has the ruach in him. He has that same life breath and spirit that we see in God throughout the Old Testament. And just previously in Numbers 27:16, where it says, that a leader is needed over, I think that NLT says creatures, but the literal translation is the God of the spirits of all flesh. Like I said, I think the NLT says the God of all creatures, but the literal translation would be the God of the spirits of all flesh. So we see this word again, but we see it in plural. We see the ha, which is the article in front of the word. So it's hā-rū-ḥōṯ, hā-rū-ḥōṭ, which means the spirits, but it's the same root word, ruach. So we have this word ruach multiple different times used in these few verses here, again, showing who God is and the spirits whom God reigns over and the spirit that he sees in Joshua and therefore says that, he is going to be the next leader. So really beautiful use of the word ruach in these passages. So the next idea is, to me, that what creates this narrative in Numbers 27 that makes this story so interesting to me, this Hebrew idea, and it's a Hebrew idea of what we call a continuing narrative. So stay with me a second. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the Hebrew language, but I'm going to put it in the simplest terms. I don't want to overwhelm anybody, but I want to give you the basic idea of what this word means because it's a really fascinating idea. So and I put this in your notes. I put all these different verses in your notes. In Numbers 27:18, the beginning of that verse says, and Yahweh said, and the Lord said. In Hebrew, it's actually, and he said Yahweh, because the verb comes first in Hebrew and then the subject. But basically it's saying, and Yahweh said. And I put the Hebrew word there, and you would pronounce it Vayomer. Vayomer. And it means, and he said. The Hebrew letter at the beginning of that word is called a vav. It kind of looks like, if you look at it, and Hebrew is right to left. So when you look at it in your notes, look at the letter on the right hand side of the word. The first letter, it looks like just kind of a staff, all right? And it's the first letter of the word on the right, and it's called a vav. And it means and. I've given you several examples of Hebrew words in the next couple verses. So if you look at those Hebrew words in your notes, just look to the first letter on the right, because that's the beginning of the word, and you'll see the first letter of each of those Hebrew words is this vav, which means and. It's just a regular conjunction, except sometimes it is used in something called a vav relative or vav consecutive. And what you really need to know is if it's one of those kinds of vavs, it means it's presenting a consecutive narrative, and it's not just a simple and, like and this and that. It's saying and as in there's a connection here. And this particular vav is different grammatically than just the regular conjunction and. So it is different grammatically when we see it. And what it's saying is there's something bigger happening in this story. There's this consecutive series of events, and they're connected. They're telling a narrative. It's like if you were telling your friend something and you're saying, and then I did this, and then this happened, and then that happened. And they all connect. They only make sense in the context of all of them together. It's not like you're just giving random ands of this and that. They connect a story. So it was interesting when I was looking at the Hebrew for these verses, that in Numbers 27:12, 27:15, and 27:18, at the beginning of each of those sentences is this vav relative consecutive, meaning they're all connected. They mean something together. And you have to look at what was said right before that vav relative or vav consecutive, and it will give you a connection. Okay. I'm going to give you first an example, and then we'll talk about this. Ruth 1. At the beginning of Ruth chapter 1, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, the very first word is and. It's this vav relative connected to the next word. And again, it's the vav relative or vav consecutive. At the beginning of the book. And that is telling you, wait a second. We're not starting. It's just like, okay, we're starting, the story of Ruth, just this totally new story, not connected to anything. It's not saying that. It's saying, and as in there was something beforehand that we're supposed to pay attention to. So, in the Hebrew Bible, the book that comes before Ruth is Proverbs. So the last thing in the Hebrew Bible is Proverbs 31. That's the last thing that would come right before Ruth 1. And in that instance, it's saying Ruth embodies this Proverbs 31 woman. She embodies that, okay? And if it's in the Septuagint, the book of Judges comes before the book of Ruth. And it's saying, you know, there's this description of these judges that, yeah, you know, I mean, God took what they did and he used it for something good, but there was a lot of wickedness in these judges. And it's contrasting that and saying, but here's something different. So all that, you know, all these judges and the violence of the time, and then it's the book of Ruth and a connection. And here's a distinction. Here's how she's different from some of those wicked judges. Okay, that's an example of how the vav relative or vav consecutive is used. So let's go back to Numbers 27. Here's the interesting thing to me. Numbers chapter 27:18, and I put in there too, I showed how some translations don't always translate it and. Some of them even omit the word and. So again, it's hard. Sometimes we miss these really amazing nuances of the Hebrew language and culture, and some different Hebrew ideas. Sometimes we miss that in the translations. So in Numbers 27:18, it says, so the Lord said to Moses, but that's the vav consecutive. It means and, as in it's connected to what happened before. So in verse 18, it says, take Joshua, son of Nun, and lay your hands on him. So he's saying, you're going to appoint Joshua. Well, what does that connect to? Let's jump up to 15. It would say, and Moses said to the Lord, may the God of all the spirits of mankind appoint a man over the community. So 18 connects to 15 because it's saying, yeah, we need a leader, and connect, God has chosen Joshua. But it goes even further, and this one surprised me the most, because 15 must connect to something, because that vav relative consecutive is saying there's a connection here. There's a narrative. So let's go up even further to chapter 12. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, and sometimes it's translated as then, and that's a pretty accurate because it's saying then, as in therefore, as in this is connected. The Lord said to Moses, go up this mountain in the Abarim range and see the land I've given you. And he's basically saying, there was a problem, you know, you rebelled against me, and, you know, you're not going to see the promised land. All right. Well, we have to go up even further because this vav relative and in verse 12 is saying it's still part of a connecting story. So what's the story that comes right before verse 12? This is going to seem random. It's the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. When they wanted to make sure that their father's inheritance was not lost, and their father did not have sons, and they were saying, we don't want to lose our father's inheritance just because he didn't have sons. And Moses brings this before the Lord, and the Lord says, yes, you know, give it to them. Because they need to have their share of this inheritance. And in the Old Testament times, and this didn't change the status of women being able to own property or anything like that, but basically that there was a problem that was acknowledged, saying they still need to be able to inherit what God had for them. Okay, so what is the connection? We have this and. We have these connecting ands, these special ands throughout these several verses that say all of this is connected. All of this goes together into a narrative that tells us something. So what is it? So the Lord did not leave the daughters of Zelophehad. He did not leave them to just perish in their problem. Nor did he leave Moses and the Israelites to just be stuck in their problem. He gave them a solution. For both the daughters of Zelophehad, things were not right, right? This was not right. They were going to lose the inheritance simply because what? Their dad didn't have sons? That didn't seem like, that wasn't good. That wasn't how it should be. And we get over to the story of Moses. He was supposed to be the leader, leading them into the promised land. Things were not how they should be. They were not how they were supposed to go. And Moses wasn't going to get to enter the promised land. And these people needed a leader. So both stories tell a very clear thing. This was not how it was supposed to be. And both the daughters of Zelophehad and the people of Israel were stuck in a situation where they needed some kind of solution. And in both cases, God said, I have a solution for you, and I will not leave it how it is, because the story's not over. The Vav relative consecutive says, the story's not over. That specific kind of and means there's still something going on. We're still connecting this narrative. So, things were not how they should have been, but the story wasn't over. God made sure that in both stories, they had what they needed. The daughters of Zelophehad needed a way to still continue the inheritance of their father. And they themselves needed, to be a part of it. And normally they couldn't in that culture without the patriarch, but they needed a way to continue to be a part of that inheritance. They needed that. And the people needed a leader. The daughters of Zelophehad needed the land. And the Israelites needed a leader to lead them into the promised land. And in both cases, God was saying, I'm going to provide the solution, because inheriting the land was a promise God gave them. And he made sure that that promise was fulfilled by allowing the daughters of Zelophehad to inherit it, even without the benefit of the dad having sons. And he appointed a new leader who had ruach in him, who would lead the Israelites to the promised land. So, I know that was a lot today. I know I brought you through a lot of different details, but I didn't want you to miss the connections. And in your life today, don't miss the connections. Sometimes those connections aren't seen right away. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes prayer and thoughtfulness and being quiet before God so he can reveal something to you. And sometimes it just says, I'm going to keep my eyes open today for what God might want to connect, because the and means the story's not over. Thanks for joining me here today, friends, and we'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.